Good evening. It is my very great pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker tonight. Annabelle Selldorf is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and principal with Sarah Lopergolo, also an alumna of Syracuse University, of Selldorf Architects, an office of approximately 35 employees located in Union Square in Manhattan. Annabelle established her practice in 1988, and over this relatively short period of time, the firm has produced a remarkable body of work that ranges from furnishings to historic renovations, from retail stores to single-family dwellings, from art galleries to condominium projects, including a recently completed 20-story residential tower. The work of the office has been widely published and has received numerous awards. In 2004, the firm incorporated a separate company called Pika, dedicated to classically modern and traditionally handcrafted furnishings, including tables, seating, lighting, fixtures, and hardware. Pika was originally an interior design company founded in the 1950s by, and I think this is significant, by Annabelle's paternal grandmother, and later run by her father, the architect Herbert Selldorf. Tonight we are celebrating the recent publication of a monograph on the firm's impressive portfolio, published this September by Monticelli Press. Following the lecture, there will be a book signing and reception in the lobby just outside the lecture hall. Born and raised in Germany, Annabelle received her Bachelor of Architecture degree from Pratt Institute and her Master of Architecture degree from Syracuse University. Of course, I would like to believe that this foreign experience with Syracuse was a defining one for Annabelle, but I also know that the trajectory of her professional life has been broad and varied, a varied one, as evidenced by the fact that she is currently the Vice President of the Architectural League on the Board of Directors of the Architectural League of New York, and serves also on the board of the Design Trust for Public Space in New York and the Chinati Foundation in Marfa, Texas, of all places. Do you commute on a regular basis? Writing in the introduction to the monograph, Jane Withers describes Selldorf Architects as, quote, a quietly robust, serious, and highly articulate voice, one that is unusually grounded in human values and concerns, unquote. As you will see this evening, this is clearly apparent in the work of this firm. Among her earlier projects, the one that most certainly secured Annabelle's reputation as a skilled designer, able to find that difficult balance between modernity and tradition, was the 2001 transformation of a 1914 Beaux-Arts building in New York into the exquisite Neue Gallery of German and Austrian art. If you have not seen this project, if you have not been to this building, I absolutely recommend it to you. This project led to other commissions such as the Aquavella Galleries in New York, the Hauser and Werth Gallery in London, this last one situated in a beautifully restored conversion of an Edwin Lutyens banking hall. I cannot imagine working in the context of an Edwin Lutyens banking hall. That would be a daunting experience. This rare ability to effectively position herself between history and modernity owes much, I believe, to the bicultural trajectory of her life, allowing her to appreciate both the traditions of the old world and the opportunities of the new one. The Pika House in Colorado, completed in 2006, and the Wainscot and Sagaponack houses on Long Island of 2007 and 2008, respectively, exemplify her talent for combining regional characteristics with a rigorous appreciation for modernist planning strategies and functional detailing. Each project resonates with its site in surprising ways. But it is the residential tower at the 211th Avenue, completed just this year, that confirms her ability to deploy these sensibilities at a much larger scale. The building is at once both autonomous in its sculptural character and respectful in the way it accommodates the immediate context. It speaks with equal confidence and authority to both modernity and tradition, to handcrafted finishes and advanced technology, a parking garage for the car that brings it right to your front door, and to a kind of monumentality that is also purposefully invested in human scale. In surveying the great variety of work, whether it is a palace restoration in Venice, a clothing store on Fifth Avenue, or a condominium in Chelsea, it is this insistence on a shared corporeality between building and body that characterizes the work of Selldorf Architects. At a time when the world seems to be preoccupied with virtual realities, Annabelle's work insists on a direct and physical encounter with her architecture. Both the metric and the métier of the work begin and end with the senses. I believe Jane Withers sums this up best in the last paragraph of her introduction to the monograph, when she notes that Juhani Pallasmaa has written, quote, "Modernist design at large has housed the intellect and the eye, but it has left the body and the senses, as well as our memories, homeless." Withers continues, maintaining that, quote, "Selldorf's architecture attempts to redress this. She foregrounds craftsmanship, materiality, and human dimensions, and sensations such as tactility alongside of conceptual rigor. There is undoubtedly a seriousness and respect for traditional values, but it is not in any way old-fashioned. It is rather in tune with our increasingly heartfelt desire for authenticity, the real and the rooted." Please join me in welcoming Annabelle Selldorf.
Hello? Hello, hello. Can you hear me? Yes? Because I can't hear myself. Well, good evening, and thank you all for coming. I'm very, very pleased to be here, and also to have my partner, Sarah Lepergolo, with me, who you can bombard with questions later on about the work, but also about what Syracuse was really like. I myself got my master's from Syracuse, as Randall so aptly said, and I'm therefore particularly happy to be here and to meet you all. Yes. It had found a very comfortable place. Maybe here. This is better. Okay. You gotta do it then. Maybe here. Okay. Is that any better? Yes? No? In the last row, can you hear me? Okay. So, the title of the lecture is Architecture and Context, and I think Randall introduced very well why what the reason for this title is. I did something that I've never done before that I'm a little bit nervous about. I bookended the pictures of our work with Le Corbusier and with Mies. I hope you don't think that that's too pretentious, but it serves a purpose. Corbusier designed a house in 1923 that was a house for his parents. And I came across this book, and I thought it was very amusing to see that he talks about going to Switzerland very happily to find a site to do his parents' house. Upon trying to translate the text, I realized that what he did is he got on the train with a set of plans in hand. However, he had never seen a site before. He knew that he wanted this house to be on the lake and that he wanted it to face south, and he gives a very clear description of what his expectations were of the site. Indeed, he had actually produced a set of drawings to explain how the plan was supposed to work, with all of the very practical things such as the entrance, the door, the vestibule for coats, the dining area, the yard to dry your laundry, etc., etc. Yet a site had not yet been even remotely identified. As you can see, he expected it all to work something like that. View of the mountains, the lake ahead of you, the facing south, ample land to take walks in. And he located everything very well as to where it should be relative to the places that he thought were important. I was fascinated with this. Why? Because we, as architects, hardly ever have the opportunity to choose context ourselves. And upon thinking about this, I thought, really, that is not true. Context merely is a tool that serves us as a purpose to focus our intention. And so what we think of when we talk about contextual is really something that leads us astray a little bit. Context is really that which we decide to use as a tool to get going, whether it is a programmatic context, whether it's a site, whether it's a personal preoccupation with structural or whatever intentions we might focus on. And so I'm leading you through a series of projects, and I'll try to stick close to my topic and not veer away too much. I've brought quite a bit of imagery, so I'll try not to linger too long. This particular project I show first because it's not in the book and I thought it'd be amusing to see, but also like Le Corbusier's Little House for His Mother, it was one of the very rare moments where we knew that we were going to design a cabin for an artist in Nova Scotia, in a place where there is neither electricity nor any plumbing anywhere available nearby, because this is on an island that you can only get to about 3 months of the year. And what we knew, we didn't know the client very well either, but what we did know from him, or from them I should say, was that they wanted a house that was obviously for a very short season, for a short time in a given season, but also something that would be completely free of the ground. And so we devised a platform for these little cabins to sit on. I'm quite pleased with it because depending on the light, you get very different readings of the surface. It's a very simple house. It was constructed by a man who usually fishes the rest of the year and who had to bring every part of the building to the site by 2 boats. They would take it to the shore, to the first shore, then they'd carry it across a little piece of land, and then they'd bring things to the next boat, carrying it all the way down to the footpath, and then carrying it up to the hill where we identified the site. So that was very complicated, and as a result, everything had to be done in such a way that the dimensions were carryable. And so here it is. You see, you're facing Madrid or something like that, right here. And the idea of this house was that you could have several cabins in which you could stay, a living cabin. Oops, how does this work now? Oh, if I don't hold my finger in front of it. There's a living cabin here, there is a sleeping cabin, there's a bathing cabin, and this is my cabin. I was very keen on having a courtyard and on focusing the vistas in different directions so that the main view is out to the ocean this way. However, in the opposite direction, this way, you have this little pond, and there's a protected area right here from where, when you sit here, you have diagonal views, but also you feel very protected from the winds. And what I'm trying to tell you here is that, again, it was, the context obviously exists, but it was our desire to focus the view and to be very practical about the house. That then led to this. Satter Farms is a building that we did a number of years ago, a little farmhouse, I should say, for a couple that moved to the North Fork of Long Island, and in an attempt to change their lives. They bought a farm, they started an organic farm, they knew nothing about farming, and so I was the right person to help them. Not. The only thing that I did know is that we wanted to do a house that related in some way or fashion to the flat landscape of Long Island. and that afforded you nice views from the upper floors, that was relatively modest in scope because, among other things, it had to be an inexpensive house. Therefore, again, similar to the other cabin that we just looked at, this had to be very easily buildable. So structurally, it had to be done in a very simple way. And we decided to stick to the local vernacular, using a flat siding rather than lap siding, and, you know, dealing with any number of sort of devices such as bi-sliding fenestrations, introducing elements like these pergolas, and trying to give dimension to very simple shapes. What always informs our work, I would say, is the desire to be practical about things. Adolf Loos once said that nothing that isn't practical can be beautiful, and I am really very much I share that opinion. This is the site plan. You can see that it's very simply organized, basically in the center of a big piece of land with a large yard that is necessary for tractors to go back and forth between there, and in a position to oversee these nice fields, these simple fields, flat lands. But the client was also very keen on having a large kitchen, being that he was a very famous 3-star chef, and that entertaining in this very small house would be of major importance. So the plan is very simply organized. It's essentially a square divided in 4, and the stair hall being the place that holds it all together. This little house, on the other hand, gave us an opportunity to be self-referential. It was a site in Long Island, again, in a largely wooded area where there were restrictive regulations about how much area you could clear. And in other words, there were no views that would inform you to do this, that, or the other thing. So in this particular case, we were entirely self-referential. It seemed to me that it was important to create spaces that didn't make you feel claustrophobic in this very sort of narrow, even dark site, but instead create a series of courtyards that would allow you to find specific areas where to be at different times of the day. Again, the client is a couple, so there were no children or no family requirements, yet all of the normal requirements such as entertaining space, etc., came to play. But I feel that this house is a really interesting solution to finding ways to deal with a local vernacular on one hand, a relatively easily buildable scheme, and again we have a series of courtyards here and here and here that lead the outside to the inside, and that make the different seasons and the different times of the day particularly agreeable. This is, by the way, not to be done at home. There is obviously a handrail missing. We were very pleased that our clients didn't want to do a handrail and closed our eyes to that. There's very nice light that comes into the house, and as I said before, those are always things that matter a great deal to us, to create clear spaces with definable proportions and readable circulation and agreeable daylight. There's an outdoor bathroom that informs creates a link to the pool, and therefore there is a vertical circulation that goes on 2 different places. The Pika House is a house that we did relatively recently in a spectacular place in Colorado, where I was lucky to spend quite a bit of time. And it's remarkable in as much that this is a small a small town that's been turned into a resort, and where there is practically no other, well, there's no real urban life around. What you're faced with is the mountains and the trees. And so when my friends asked me to design a house for them, my references were log cabins. And it's difficult to design a modern house with reference to log cabins. We looked around, we found all sorts of references. There are mining towers that are interesting to look at. The hardest thing to come to grips with is to say, when you define on one end the requirements for a family of 5 with all of the accoutrements that go along with that, you end up with a house that is probably somewhere between 4,500 and 5,000 square feet. Log cabins typically are 450 to 500 square feet. So there's a difference in scale there that's difficult to reconcile. And I felt very strongly that it was important to find some way to modulate these differences in scale. The materiality, as you will see, is another issue because, needless to say, people can build houses of concrete or glass pavilions or any number of things. But it seemed to me that there was a particular need to create something that was recognizable to the eye, but yet showed it in a different way. I like this picture very much because, in a way, it shows everything that got this project started. It's all about doing something very vertical, a very vertical mountain and a very vertical building. And we were lucky to do this building that has 5 stories, a freestanding 5-story little house in the mountains, unheard of because code regulations would usually allow you to build something that has 3 stories. This is one of the very few communities in Colorado that has simply no zoning laws. So what we built was a little Seagram's Tower in the west, and the design is simple enough, consists out of, I should go back to this, has a steel frame with the front square of the building being entirely framed in steel and glass. I was really pleased to find that the contractor, who was an excellent person, managed to find a steel builder who delivered this steel frame all in one piece, all 63 feet of it, only a 1/4 inch out of plumb. So there is a technical aspect to all of that is really interesting and was plenty complicated. If you had enough time for it, I would tell you the whole story because it was very exciting to see it go up, to see the flatbed truck come down the street and see 3 guys erect the frame for this little building. It did take 2 years to build because it's technically very complicated, or rather very sophisticated, I should say. But what I like about it is that it's a very discrete building. And one of the issues is, of course, that through the seasons are very, very tough on buildings. It gets very cold and very hot, and a lot of the time the people who asked me to build this house are not there. So we devised a system of shutters that, frankly, I had the idea because I went to Paris at some point and I saw that these large 19th century buildings have iron shutters in their windows, and so I thought, that's an interesting thing because it's an available commodity, so we can probably find steel shutters that they can just ship to Colorado. Well, needless to say, that wasn't exactly the case, but these 10-foot tall shutters were made of aluminum, and they're done in such a way that they can provide ventilation on one side, but also that they protect the building completely when nobody is around, so that it stands on its own with a blind facade, and I'm quite pleased with that. The back of the building is really not the back of the building, it's the south side of the building, faces up mountain. There are lesser views. They're beautiful all the same because they look into the trees. But again, here the theme of wanting to shut the building down completely, and so there are punched openings and much more restrictive views, whereas to the west and to the north you have these very large, extensive window openings, and this is one of the views. The plan is quite simple and relies on the fact that when you stack things, you have to sort of try to make plumbing go on top of other plumbing, and we were very ambitious in trying to make circulation as small as possible so as to keep the footprint really small. I think the building is altogether 4,300 square feet, and all circulation happens in that stair. But the stair, of course, is a little bit more than just a stair. It also is the spine that goes through the building, and so it was equally as important for that to be an agreeable thing to walk up and down. And you'll gather from all of this that I'm very interested in, on one hand, making a sort of clear, creating a clear partie, but one that is physically realized in with a real understanding of how we move around space, how we circulate in a plan, and how we live in a building. So the ground floor is a kitchen and a dining area. There is an entrance and a mudroom, and then you go up these stairs, and there's even a little elevator here, which is very, very slow, but it exists all the same. In the floors above, I don't think we have all of the floor plans. There's a living room, 2 children's rooms here, a master bedroom, and a central station, office, library right there. It's quite nice to see how you can fit these functions over and above, and how when you move through the building, your views change with the same focus on the mountains. Here you can see the staircase, which sort of wraps through the building and becomes a permanent reference to all of the spaces. And this is what it looks like in the winter and at night. Shortly after receiving this commission, we were also asked to design a house in Colorado, in Vail, of a slightly larger footprint for a slightly different kind of family. But you start thinking about subjects of one kind, and then you carry them on to the next project because you've started to do research, and so you explore your own interests in space and technology, probably, listening all the while to the particular requirements of a particular client and adapting to the different site conditions. So while it's in Colorado, the landscape of Vail is very, very different from the landscape of Telluride. It's much less harsh, it's much more, there's much gentler slopes, it's a much more open sky land there, and so a completely different idea of how you would move around the plan motivated us when we designed this house. It was very clear to me that with all these large-scale mountains in the far distance, what you needed was a counterpoint to the big view. So the house is organized around a courtyard with a bedroom tower on the far end. The materials here are a little bit different, though again, there's use of stone. But we were pleased to find ways of working with blackened copper, which is simply spectacular as you see it in the course of the day, picking up the light in different ways. It's also a very good material to keep the heat inside, and we have an all copper roof organized, running around this courtyard that I just mentioned, and here's a view of the tower. One thing that I got very preoccupied with, and again, perhaps that talks a little bit about the context, is that as you find ways to put volumes in different proportions to one another, we started to think about materials. In my view, it's always more interesting to come up with the materials after you've come up with the partie, thinking that it's really more about structure, space, and proportions. But I was driving on my way to the airport, and I saw a little cabin along the road that had was entirely constructed of 2x6s, and it was absolutely beautiful because you could see that there was a structural quality about the stacked lumber, and it was such a simple device to make a heavy enclosure with wood that it seemed like it was a masonry enclosure. So I climbed up a little hill out of the car, up a hill, only to see that in fact it was a completely primitive thing. And I took photographs and so on, passed them on to the contractor, who immediately told us that this was the most impossible thing to do and nobody could possibly do this well. But in the end we prevailed, and I was very happy to see that we could use what's called beetle kill lumber, because there's a beetle that's eating all of the trees around there, and so you end up with loads of dead wood that is not used for much. And so it was cut down and stacked in thin boards, and we have about a 6-inch wood thickness, which gives you a particularly beautiful R value. Sorry. A brand new pond was part of the scheme, and so locating the house on this pond, on the view, juxtaposing different spaces to one another, having at once intimacy and interaction with nature are the main topics. Here you see the plan. One of the things that I had to sort of think my way through very carefully was accepting the fact that if the house was oriented toward the pond right here and creating a driveway that was going all the way around a mountain back here, we ended with, how does this work? With a garage in there that gave us a house without a facade. And, you know, typically as architects we think the first thing has got to be the most important and impressive idea of a house. I was actually rather happy to think that you would never see the house. You would only ever discover it as you were promenading around the site. In other words, this addresses a condition that's entirely anti-urban and relies completely on the use of the land. This house is located, as I mentioned before, facing large trees, but it also it's a large piece of land, so not being bound to just seeing it at that one time when you come into the house was actually an interesting exploration. Views from the house. By contrast then, completely urban is a project that we completed relatively recently, and as Randall said earlier, we've done a lot of projects that are art related. So one of the things that I find interesting is to talk to people, to art dealers and to museum directors, to clients in the arts, and understand their completely different points of view. We'll show you a couple of galleries in the course of this lecture. And in many ways, I think that they're as different from one another because they are a response to the different personality, to the different ideas about how to exhibit art and what the parameters to viewing art can be. In this particular case, we worked with a client, Barbara Gladstone, who I had done work before, and she called me up one day and said, "It's wonderful, I bought a new site, I'm not sure that we can keep the building." And this was the building that she bought. It was a sound studio that had only been built, I don't know, 7 years prior, and it had a very large sound space, but it was absolutely useless for our purposes. And so with a heavy heart, I sort of said, I think we actually have to tear this down. My heart wasn't that heavy, in all honesty. But it does seem like one has to take responsibility for taking something down that's completely intact and perfectly workable for something. But in the end, we decided that that was the only thing that could be done, and so we built a slightly larger, taller exhibition space. It's a gallery that has one major exhibition space and two smaller gallery spaces and accommodates a little office. And the mandate became increasingly specific. To begin with, it was, we're going to build a building that accommodates very large sculptures. Eventually, we understood that it had to include an elevator that was 10 by 10 feet that could carry 50,000 pounds or some such thing, and had to, serve all sorts of purposes. What I enjoyed about the project is the idea that we had an opportunity to do something that was really completely about space and completely about one facade. That one facade had to at once represent something of the gallery and also in our minds relate to the neighborhood. The neighborhood of Chelsea, I don't know how well you know it, is now lived in by many, many contemporary art galleries, now beginning by shops. There are lots of residential buildings that have recently gone up. But at one time, it was an industrial area. And so some of that industrial character, unlike, say, neighborhoods like Soho, is actually very tough. They're concrete buildings with large structures, and so it felt like the right thing to do to relate to that neighborhood. We chose brick for the facade, and I guess I went in the wrong direction. We saw that all the surrounding buildings were brick buildings. You can imagine that in the next few years this is going to go away and something very, very tall is coming here. We're talking about a neighborhood that's subject to complete change. So you don't know what you're referencing. You can say, yes, I am referencing the neighborhood, but what is that neighborhood? Maybe it's not going to be there next year because, another condominium building is going to go up. It seemed, however, to us that finding some kind of grounding, finding some kind of urban space, something that the human body could relate to, was of some importance. And I think that turned out quite nicely. The brick that we used here is very, very dense. It's a Danish brick from a company called Petersen. It's a Columba brick. And it was fun to see the mason experiment with it and try out different kinds of raking of the joints using different colors, grout. And we realized that what we really wanted was something that is very monumental and very, very stark, but at the same time has a texture that the person can relate to. And I think that worked out well. Earlier, we did a building on 13th Street where some of the same issues were at work. To begin with, there was a 3-story manufacturing building, and the developer client had acquired a permit to add, I think, altogether 6 stories. And it was meant to be a commercial building, it was meant to be a commercial art building, perhaps, but we weren't very involved for once with the client of the inside, but rather served the developer who wanted to make a coherent building. One of the code requirements was to have a setback, I think 60 feet above ground, which makes the street wall in the new zoning code. And so thinking about what to do, we decided that toothing the brick in and staying in the same kind of facade language for the first new 3 stories would be the thing to do. So that was our first experience working with different kinds of brick. And this is what it looks like now. What I think was very important about this scheme is that we experimented quite a while with whether the added 3 stories would in fact be the same material, whether they should be set back artificially, but of course the developer didn't want to give a square foot away. And in the end, I also thought that the street wall actually made sense. There is a kind of presence that the building has from the street level that is very nice, and when you see the sort of shiny black brick, there is a relationship to craft that you don't find very much anymore. But on a larger urban scale, that kind of metal top reads in a very different way from different points in the city. Occasionally this has been called the stealth bomber. I don't know whether that's good or bad. Again, the juxtaposition of sort of an existing vernacular to a completely different language that has a larger scale. This building on the Upper East Side was one of the first new townhouses we did for the purposes of art gallery client who we've done a lot of work with. And it's important to mention that what made this project difficult was that the existing townhouse, again, didn't at all fit our requirements to make an interesting gallery space that allowed the owner to bring in large works of art, that allowed the owner to have large amounts of daylight, and accommodated a secondary program on the upper floors. Also, this is an area in New York City that's subject to very, very strict landmarks considerations. So building a completely different kind of building in this existing fabric was out of the question. Instead, we experimented with proportions in a punched facade, taking these rather large French windows and bringing them in a very disciplined way up and down the building, showing the lower ceiling heights with smaller windows. Windows get smaller as they go up, and using a concrete cement facade rather than a limestone facade, and negotiating that with landmarks and making them appreciate the subtle differences between a modern building and a not so modern building was quite a feat. In the end, we managed to have a very large sort of chapel-like exhibition space in to the very south of the building, filling in an existing courtyard. And these kinds of projects are interesting because they make you understand how the city is put together, what interior courtyards are for, light and air. And in this particular case, we took a little bit of light and air away, and I'm of two minds about it. But we created light and air in this room anyway. These are some of the interior spaces. Now, we've heard Randall talk a little bit about the Neue Galerie, and just quickly, here is the story of the building, a sort of French Renaissance brick and limestone building. At one time was built or was commissioned by William Starr Miller. It says here 1915. Sometimes we hear 1914, sometimes 1917. What's remarkable about this building is that it is designed by Carrera and Hastings, and one of the last private mansions on Fifth Avenue before the city changed, and along Fifth Avenue you found these very large apartment buildings. it seemed a little bit like a building in the boondocks when people moved into it right at that particular time. It was far north. There was not very much going on. Central Park was not as fancy as it is nowadays. But it was a private building. Later, I think in the early 50s, it was taken up by the Evo Institute and became the home for all the documents of the Nuremberg trial. Quite an interesting piece of history, and many people went there and studied these documents. So this building had a particular kind of aura about it, and by the time that we were commissioned with this renovation, the only thing that we knew was that we had to fit in a new elevator, we had to fit in a museum-type climate control, but nobody knew exactly what this museum was going to be. We knew that it was going to be dedicated to German and Austrian art, and German and Austrian art up to 1945 was the mandate. So it was about that period in Germany and Austria, turn of the century up through the war, that is the early modernist times. And so the juxtaposition of this traditional building to a modern time is actually very interesting. And you can see here the old Career and Hastings plans. Much to our surprise, this wonderful monumental staircase, which makes the center of the building now, wasn't there at that time. Also, I was amused to see that when we were commissioned with this building, there had been another architect previously commissioned with the same job, who had produced a little bit of work, anyway, the demo drawings, which read very clearly, demolish monumental stair. So I think we got this job in the nick of time and saved that from happening. You can, I'll just run through the plans. There's a wonderful glass roof that serves as a courtyard to the office and brings daylight all the way down to the ground floor. And a lot of the old paneling remained. And this was one of the projects where I'm showing here a picture of the Secessionist Building in 1897, only to say there were these two things going on at the same time. There is on one hand the renovation, restoration of the building, and on the other hand relating to the mandate of the building, showing art and architecture and design of the early 20th century. And the reference always would be the Wiener Werkstätte, Otto Wagner, etc. I'm sure you're all very familiar with that. So here are some pictures of the building before the restoration. And renovation, restoration is a very interesting subject unto itself, because it always addresses that which is old, that has to be repaired, and has to be repaired in such a way that it comes across as believable, authentic, and solid. That part of a renovation that logically really makes part of the old fabric, and that part of the renovation where you have to distinguish yourself by saying, here is another architect who did something. In this particular case, the thing that really was very clearly not part of the old fabric is obviously all of the lighting, where we sort of referenced a little bit the Vienna school, if you will. And the elevator, which goes through the building and was very clearly not part of the existing fabric. So when you do this kind of work, I always think you have to deal with it with surgical attention. It's a very different part of the brain that you occupy, because it's not about making space. It's about making sense of the existing fabric. And once again, the word context comes up quite naturally. On the heels of the Neue Galerie, we were asked to renovate a very similar building, the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, a few blocks down from the Neue Galerie. another limestone mansion that at one time had been a private building and later served another institution, and now is part of New York University, and is a PhD giving place for scholars to read and study about the ancient world. The patron who commissioned the work, our work, was a person who was very interested in archaeology and has a wonderful collection of archaeological finds all over the world, and was very interested in juxtaposing old and new. When we started to think that the renovation was really just about making handicapped requirements work, making it possible to bring large works of art in, making existing spaces such as this oval staircase perfect, renovating or restoring rather these large exhibition halls. In the end, what was really interesting was the opportunity to make a 3-story modern library in the back half of the building. And that was one of those things that there was a library that was part of the program, and as we were working on the plans, I had this thought that it had to be completely different from every other part of the building, and it was an opportunity to make a significant structural intervention, and we inserted a 4-story steel skeleton in this 3-story volume of the building, and thereby achieved room for more books, but that was really more an argument than anything else. Essentially, it was really about the idea of, taking an element that creates sort of a communal sense of studying in a different kind of space relative to the old world. Finally, I'm not sure that this is finally, but anyway, coming up to the end. Abercrombie and Fitch has been our client for some time now, and we are in charge of designing their flagship stores. This is the first one, the New York City one. And we like to say that we're pleased mostly about the fact that we were able to return the building back to the city, because in recent years it had been another fashion store that had created a terrible elevation on the ground by just cladding the ground with travertine. And when we were commissioned with this job, we found old photographs and said, aha, there was a haberdasher in this location before. Why not use that as an orientation? And not all too slavishly, here you see what it looked like. Not all too slavishly, we created this steel and glass volume. And it's a little bit unusual because unlike a lot of retail establishments, this is one where you can't look into the store. And there's a sense of curiosity that is inspired, hopefully, as with the lighting and these louvers. Oftentimes people say, it's like a club inside, and I don't like that part of the conversation so much because yes, it's dark, and yes, it's loud, and yes, there are half-naked people standing around there, but I think the architectural space is very nice, and when you take the time to look, you will see that the detailing is very, very beautifully done and very carefully done, and even if you don't look, I think you will feel it, and it seems that we've had a pretty successful run of it. It was fun to design these very tricky vitrines, and now we're completing one of the stores in Tokyo, making a store that's 11 stories tall on a very, very small footprint. I'm quite excited about it, not only because it's a new building and you're doing something in Tokyo, but also because it's an unusual store concept. Have you ever seen a store for one and the same kind of thing for 11 stores? It's really just all staircase. And it's pretty exciting. I also think it looks very beautiful and is commensurate with all these other buildings surrounding it. Has a very elegant steel and glass facade, similar in detail to the one that we established in New York, but in a way articulated differently over the tall volume. Here you can see that the front half, actually a little bit more than the front half of the building, is all dedicated to circulation. So there's very little shopping going on and a lot of other things, whatever they may be. There is a language that was established with the client for these flagship stores. And I'm often asked, is this one also dark? Is this one also loud? And there's only one thing you can say, and that's yes. I, however, think that what's really interesting about doing these different flagship stores is there are totally different typologies of buildings. In Milan, we just did a shop in a building that was designed by Joe Ponti originally, and so the spatial configuration is completely different. And the client is interesting enough to allow us to explore that and to make a very clear plan. And all the decor aside, I think they actually are very good architectural spaces. Finally, 211th Avenue is the building that Randall briefly talked about. It's located in Chelsea. It's dominated beautifully by the Stuart Lehigh building and the High Line. This is what the neighborhood looked like at one time. And as I mentioned earlier when I showed you Barbara Gladstone's gallery, this neighborhood is subject to such dramatic change. It's really quite unusual because there's an enormous amount of building going on with all these new residential towers by Jean Nouvel, by Frank Gehry, by Shigeru Ban, and we figure in amongst them. And we were asked to design a building, again, on a very small footprint on the corner of 24th and 11th Avenue. And the thing that was interesting about this site was the fact that you could really only do these one apartment per floor buildings. It's 19 stories tall. There are 16 apartments. 14 of them are duplex apartments, and they're sort of in a yin-yang configuration. And eventually we realized there was no way that we could have parking on that site, but it was deemed a necessary luxury item, if you will. So after much debate and almost jokingly, we said, well, why not just make an elevator for the cars? And that idea stuck. We couldn't go down into the ground because the water table is very high. It would have been extremely costly to do a sort of bathtub type parking garage. Quite frankly, we didn't really have enough room either to accommodate turning radiuses in the building. So the elevator concept really made a lot of sense. But it was very difficult to get this through planning and through community boards, etc., because people were terribly worried that this was a dangerous thing to do. In the end, we managed to prove that it's really relatively straightforward, that it's not very difficult to do, but in the end it is very, very expensive to do, and it really only suits a purpose of one such small footprint building because there's only storage for one car per floor. So it's something that I think is a fairly unique thing, but people got very excited about it, when in fact the thing that we found exciting was the opportunity that 16 apartments in a building that is 250 feet tall would allow us to design apartments that have exceptionally high ceiling heights. So some of the apartments have a standard ceiling height of 11 feet, but some other spaces are as much as 23 feet tall. Now, that's a difficult thing to do because a 23-foot high space easily lacks intimacy, easily doesn't feel residential. And I think we managed to do something that really straddles both requirements. There are issues of transparency. Our competitors for the same site had designed all glass buildings, and the discourse within the office between Sarah and myself had been very much that we didn't want to see another building that didn't relate to the street, that didn't relate to people actually walking, however outlandish that might sound. So what we did is we designed a facade, again, respecting the 60-foot street wall, the lower portion of the building being clad with terracotta that lends itself to being shaped and having sort of color and a tactile interest. And the upper part of the building having a scrim or a screening type device, which is made in stainless steel. There was a desire to do something that's not completely straightforward. So we explored making shapes and playing around with the opportunity to shape material. And both of these, the terracotta as well as the stainless steel, obviously lend themselves to that in ways that we found very appealing. At the same time, there is a great deal of transparency that the building affords. The windows are in fact floor-to-ceiling glass, but we introduced a second layer of munted glass so as to give you a little bit of protection from the inside. Here you can see how this works. You drive in from one side, you drop somebody off if you want to, and you drive into the elevator, and as you get to your floor, you pull back, you park your car, and you find your way to your apartment. It's a tall building, as you can see. It's a skinny one, and so making the structure work was very significant and caused us a lot of problems because the concrete ended up being so much bigger than anybody ever wanted it to be, eating up a lot of space. But here is a section. It shows the relationship to the river and the car, renderings of the spaces, opportunities to use your two-story tall spaces. And this is what the space looks like now that it's still under construction. But they're pretty marvelous spaces, and I'm very excited to see it being done. Well, I'm coming to the end of this little talk, and I'll end with a few images of Mies van der Rohe, also in 1923, at a time when the world was changing so much. I don't know whether it's changing quite as much right now, but some of the same thoughts, I think, preoccupy us, and they have to do with how do we build today? How do you make architecture meaningful? Among other things, I think that Mies made a very interesting statement, and that is that what you see is so much less of what architecture is all about. And that's what I think too. Thank you.
Your buildings act as frames for context as much as the context frames the buildings. And I'm wondering, I found myself wanting more views from the insides of your buildings. Could you talk about how you might frame landscape or frame elements of the urban fabric, as well as allowing the urban fabric or the kind of rural landscape to frame the buildings themselves?
Well, it's interesting that you ask that, because I think it talks a little, this has to do a little bit with process. As a young architect, the first project I ever did was a kitchen. The next project I did was a kitchen and a bathroom. project after that was a kitchen, a bathroom, and a living room. And that went on for a long while, and what it fostered was thinking about interior space a long time before you were thinking about exterior space and creating volumes. And so in some ways I think it's correct to say that the way we conceive of buildings is very much from the inside out. It has very much to do with where do you arrive and what do you do when you do arrive, and how do you move around the building. And practically all of my initial concept sketches are plans rather than elevations or sections or three-dimensional drawings. But they always have to do with what do you feel, what do you see, what do you get. That's hard to show unless you want to be here until tomorrow. We have plenty of interior photographs of the work, but of course I'm a little bit interested, like all of us architects are, to see what happens when you take that outside, and how can you make a plausible whole from the inside to the outside and maintain structural integrity and, you know, live up to all of the big goals that make up an architectural space. And so, yes, I think, I don't know whether that this answers your question, but it starts all with the function, it all starts with circulation and interior space, and a vision about how big, how wide, where does the light come from, how do you experience light, how does the space makes you feel. When I say I don't think about materials, I think I can honestly say that that is true, but in an intuitive way. Of course, you absorb all of that already, and you bring that into your conceptualizing.
In the first project that you showed us, you dealt with a project that had to be carried across a pretty
Yes.
intense terrain. How do you look at that aspect of having to design the project to be transported, to be built, as a positive aspect of design to open up opportunities rather than a limitation?
Well, to begin with, I think you try to look at everything as a positive opportunity rather than as a limitation, because if you think of it as a limitation, it's very difficult to move forward. Rather than thinking of it, though, in any particular way, positive or negative, I think you think of it as a condition. And creating conditions for the work is part of our process, I think. We're very respectful of a client's program. We're very respectful of a client's budget. I'm really interested to relating our architecture to a particular location rather than saying it's a universal general thing. And in a way, that is why I showed the Corbusier house, is because there's different ways of thinking about it. I'm not the one to say that it's right or wrong, but for us, being specific and precise to the set of conditions that we find ourselves in is very important, and becomes a tool to sort of generate ideas.
Annabelle, I'm very much interested in this problem, this issue of the jumping in scale. That many of your projects are relatively small scale, including the museum projects. The last one you showed, and some others that I know that you've done, represent an order of magnitude that is pretty significant jump. What were the challenges that you and Sarah faced when you took on a project like the condominium that you just showed us, in terms of moving from that more intimate scale of a gallery, of a Abercrombie and Fitch, of the houses that you did, to the scale of a 20-story tower?
In a funny way, I don't think that was a problem, and that may be to our detriment, because we do that the same way that we do everything else. You sort of have to make a problem manageable. You have to, bring it to the size in which you can handle it. And I think that that's one of the big problems we have in architecture today, is that those very large projects that we see all around are so much driven by a lack of understanding of how small it has to get in order to be comprehensible. What I mean by that is that we spend an inordinate amount of time trying to fit the pieces together and making sense of the whole. But the problem is not so much could we manage the scale. I think the problem is how complicated it is to fit that in a larger budget, in a larger time frame. And I think the 211 is actually successful on exactly that. It is incredibly precisely designed. The floor plans are really very beautiful, if I say so myself. But to have that kind of precision translated in a large building site, that is where it gets difficult. I think it's costly, for one. Is a good floor plan costly? Not really. But getting a building built with precision and with the kind of attention to detail that we are used to from our smaller projects, that's very hard to do. And to understand how to manage the process, how to handle 20 consultants rather than 4, that's complicated.